Every sport carries intensity, a hunger for victory. In MMA, that intensity borders on animal. But what happens when that savagery escapes the octagon and invades real life? This is the story of Jonathan Koppenhaver. You might know him as War Machine, a name he chose for himself, an identity forged in brutality, where violence wasn't just part of the game, it was its essence. He was a promising UFC fighter, with explosive talent and a presence that mixed charisma and danger. He was also a star in the adult film industry, and for a time he seemed to have it all. But the line between the aggressive persona and the real man never truly existed. War Machine never turned off the ring. He never left the violence in the locker room, and that would come at a high cost. This video isn't just about a fighter. It's about a cycle, a reflection of unresolved trauma. It's about how the past shapes the present, and how toxic masculinity, the lack of psychological support, and the romanticization of aggression can create a monster. How did a boy raised in an unstable home, who saw his father die before his eyes, end up at the center of one of the most brutal domestic violence cases in recent memory? What led War Machine to transform from athlete to abuser? And what can we learn from it? In the next few minutes, you'll see John's full journey, from a troubled childhood to the peak of fame and the brutal collapse. An intimate and shocking portrait of a man consumed by his own fury. If you think you've seen it all in the world of fighting, think again. Because the story of War Machine isn't about winning inside the octagon. It's about losing everything outside of it. Jonathan Koppenhaver was born on November 30th, 1981, in California. He was the typical suburban kid, working-class parents, a modest life, simple routines. His father was a police officer. His mother, a homemaker. At first glance, it seemed like a normal family. But behind closed doors, there was pain, silence, and a growing emotional breakdown. John's mother fell into a deep spiral of depression when he was still a child. Without structure or treatment, she began using substances to numb the pain, and that had a direct impact on John's life. At a very young age, John took on the role of caregiver, trying to keep the household running while managing his mother's instincts. It was a complete role reversal. The child taking care of the parent, trying to protect her from herself. It gave him a distorted sense of responsibility, an emotional weight no child under 10 should ever carry. At 13, the breaking point came. On an otherwise ordinary morning, his father began feeling unwell at home. A heart attack. John, still just a boy, desperately tried to save him. He tried to resuscitate him, called emergency services, but it was too late. He watched his father die right in front of him, and it shattered him inside. The trauma was never addressed, never processed, and that buried pain turned into rage. School became a conflicted place. On one hand, John was smart. He learned easily and stood out. On the other, he was volatile, impulsive. He developed aggressive behavior, fought with teachers, clashed with classmates. It was as if the world was always against him, and he had to fight all the time. There was no room for vulnerability, only for defense. Without a stable home and no emotional support, John closed himself off. He built layers of coldness and toughness. Rage became his shield, and deep down, all he wanted was for someone to see his pain. But no one did. They only saw the rebellious kid. The problem. In that context, sports began to emerge as a way out. First informally, fights, physical challenges among friends, shoving matches. Then in gyms. It was the only place where anger made sense, where yelling, punching, and exploding weren't punishable. They were techniques. John realized that in that universe, his pain became power. His trauma became fuel. As a teenager, he began training in martial art, and through that, he found something rare in his life: structure, clear rules, discipline, and, paradoxically, peace. Because inside the ring, everything made sense. It was an arena where he could be himself, aggressive, intense, emotionally charged, without judgment. There, his rage was valid. But what no one realized was that even though he had found something in the sport, John never dealt with his. He learned to weaponize pain, but he never healed it. And because of that, he would carry that emotional bomb for the rest of his life. John began serious training in the early 2000s. With a mix of raw strength and uncommon dedication, he quickly caught attention in San Diego gym. MMA was on the rise. The UFC was starting to gain popularity, and the name Jonathan Koppenhaver was surfacing behind the scenes as a promising talent. His style was explosive, aggressive, a confrontational stance that mirrored his internal battles. At 19, he saw the reality show The Ultimate Fighter as an opportunity to prove himself. Initially rejected, fate stepped in. After another contestant dropped out, John was brought into the cast of Season 6. Inside the house, he was a force of nature. Intense, provocative, unpredictable. His temperament drew more attention than his skills, but that also made for good TV. Audiences loved the chaos he caused. Despite a performance full of highs and lows, he stood out enough to earn a UFC fight. And so, War Machine was born, not just as a nickname. In 2008, John made a dramatic decision. He legally changed his name to War Machine. He wanted to become the character, to live the persona. For him, it wasn't just branding. It was identity. It was a way to survive in a world that had never understood him. Inside the Octagon, War Machine was impressive. His aggressive style and willingness for bloody confrontations made him a fan favorite. He won important fights and seemed to be on the path to stardom. But outside the cage, his explosive personality remained a problem. In 2007, he was accused of assault after a bar fight. It was the first in a long line of violent incidents. He didn't show remorse. On the contrary, he embraced the violent persona. He laughed at his own excesses. In interviews, he made distasteful jokes and displayed a warped view of masculinity. He began racking up legal issues, bar fights, altercations with fans, conflicts with event organizers. Wherever he went, War Machine brought tension. But MMA wasn't enough. In 2009, War Machine entered the adult film industry. The decision shocked many, but he seemed comfortable with the shift. He said that at least there, he didn't have to pretend to be someone else. He filmed dozens of scenes and became well known in that world as well. The combination of professional fighter and porn actor made him a unique and controversial figure. Balancing both careers, John seemed to have found a space where he could be himself without judgment. But it was an illusion. Behind the fame, he remained unstable. In 2010, another violent incident. War Machine assaulted a man in a nightclub. He was sentenced to just over 2 years in prison. In jail, he didn't change. He remained volatile, got into trouble with other inmates, was placed in solitary confinement multiple times. Even while incarcerated, he kept his social media presence active. He published letters, shared public reflections on anger, masculinity, and society. In some, he showed glimpses of self-awareness. In others, he reinforced his destructive mindset. He was a man torn between the desire for redemption and pride in his violent identity. After being released, he launched his own clothing brand, started recording personal videos where he discussed his inner conflicts, media criticism, and how the world didn't accept strong men. These videos had a conspiratorial tone, showing that far from having changed, War Machine was still at war with himself. In 2013, his life changed once more. He met Christine McInday, better known as Christy Mack, one of the biggest stars in the adult film industry at the time. Their relationship started out intense and passionate, but it would soon become the catalyst for his complete destruction. At first, John and Christy Mack's relationship seemed like a modern-day love story between two unconventional celebrities. He, a famous fighter with a controversial past. She, a top adult film actress with millions of fans, united by fame, intensity, and a non-traditional lifestyle. On social media, smiling photos, kisses, workouts together. But behind the public image, there was control, jealousy, and possessiveness. War Machine didn't know how to love, at least not in a healthy way. The relationship quickly turned toxic. He wanted to dominate, to monitor, to mold Christy. He began controlling her clothes, who she talked to, where she went. And when she resisted, his reaction came in emotional outbursts and, over time, physical violence. Christy tried to hide the abuse for a while. Close friends noticed bruises, changes in behavior, fear in her eyes. But she kept insisting everything was fine. This is common in abusive relationships. The victim believes the abuser will change, that love can heal, that somehow the blame is shared. In April 2014, she decided to end it. Enough was enough. John didn't accept it. He began stalking her, sending aggressive messages, trying to regain control. For months, he fluctuated between reconciliation attempts and threats. Christy kept her distance, and War Machine, now without control over the only person he believed he loved, began to lose the little stability he had left. On August 8, 2014, he broke into Christy Mack's apartment in Las Vegas. She was with a friend, fellow actor Corey Thomas. War Machine arrived unannounced, saw the two together, and snapped. What followed was one of the most brutal assaults ever documented in a domestic violence case. For more than 2 hours, John beat Corey until he was unconscious and covered in blood. Then he turned on Christy. Physical and verbal abuse, humiliation. He broke her nose, ribs, and teeth. He tore out her hair, slammed her head against furniture. He tried to force her to shower to clean the scene. He told her he was going to kill her. Christy only survived because, in a moment of distraction, she managed to escape. She jumped out a window and ran naked to a neighbor's house, screaming for help. What police officers found when they arrived was straight out of a horror movie. Blood everywhere, broken furniture, a trail of emotional and physical destruction. War Machine had fled, launching a brief manhunt. For days, the case dominated U.S. news outlets. Photos of Christie's disfigured face shocked the public. Her statements, brave and detailed, sparked both outrage and compassion. War Machine was finally located and arrested a week later, hiding in a motel. After being taken into custody, he attempted suicide in his cell, slashing his wrists with a makeshift blade. He survived, but the trial had to be postponed for several weeks. In court, he tried to present himself as a victim of circumstance, claimed he was a product of childhood trauma, that he didn't know how to handle rejection, that he loved Christy and wanted another chance. But the facts were too cruel to be ignored. During the trial, more than 30 charges were brought against him, including attempted murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, severe bodily injury, and death threats. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury found him guilty on nearly all counts. In 2017, War Machine was sentenced to life in prison, with a possibility of parole after 36 years. The verdict was symbolic, not just because of the severity of the crime, but because of what it represented, a reflection of everything that had been ignored throughout John's life. The untreated trauma, the aggressive behavior fueled by fame, the misguided view of masculinity as unquestionable strength, a society that consumes violence as entertainment, yet is shocked when it explodes. And War Machine's fall was complete. There was no glamour left, no idol to admire, just a broken man, imprisoned, forever marked as a symbol of what can go wrong when we ignore the sign. The story of War Machine is more than a crime report. It's an in-depth X-ray of how untreated trauma, emotional distortion, and the glamorization of violence can become a ticking time bomb. Jonathan Koppenhaver wasn't born a monster. He was shaped by years of pain, neglect, and bad choices, both personal and societal. It's easy to point fingers, to say it was a lost cause. But if we look closely, we see something bigger, a system that fails to recognize warning signs. A sports world that often rewards aggression without offering real psychological. A culture that equates masculinity with dominance and vulnerability with weakness. John was a victim, but he was also responsible. And it's in that duality where the discomfort lies. Because accepting that monsters are made, not born, forces us to look around and realize how many other war machines are being created in silence. Christy Mack survived. She rebuilt her life. She became an activist against domestic violence, using her voice to protect other women. Her strength is one of the most powerful aspects of this story. A survivor who refused to be silent, who turned pain into purpose. And War Machine? He now lives behind bars, with all the time in the world to reflect on what he became. Maybe someday he'll find a form of redemption, but that won't erase the scars he left on himself and on those around him. This story needs to be remembered, not as a morbid curiosity, but as a warning about the dangers of ignoring the sign, about the urgent need for emotional support, for education on healthy affection, for addressing anger before it turns into tragedy. Sport is strength, but it must also be balance. Masculinity can be powerful as long as it's healthy, and all rage is a disguised cry for help. If this video moved you in any way, share it with someone. Subscribe to the channel for more real stories that need to be told. And remember, acknowledging pain is the first step to breaking the cycle. The conviction of Jonathan Koppenhaver marked the end of a destructive cycle, but not the end of the discussion. After the trial, his name vanished from sports and entertainment media. He became a taboo subject, a tragic case many prefer to forget. But there are still important questions that linger. War Machine was more than just a man with destructive behavior. He was a distorted reflection of systems that neglect men's mental health, that treat aggression as an absolute virtue, and that fail to provide real support for men carrying deep trauma. For years, he was praised for his instability, celebrated as an old-school fighter, a man who spoke his mind, a bad boy who drew attention. But when the violence turned on someone outside the cage, everyone was shocked. The truth is, the signs were there from the beginning, from a childhood marked by pain to the early episodes of violence. But no one wanted to listen. Toxic masculinity, the distorted idea that men must be tough, invulnerable, dominant, was one of the gears that powered his downfall. From a young age, John was taught not to show weakness, to hide pain, to respond with strength. And when he had nowhere else to direct that strength, it turned on those around him. But what if John had received help as a child? What if after his father's death, he had access to therapy? If someone had recognized the signs and offered support, maybe he would never have become War Machine. Maybe he would still be just Jonathan. Of course, none of this erases his responsibility. He chose to hurt. He chose violence, even when other paths were available. But reflecting on the context is important to prevent more stories like this from happening. The goal isn't to forgive, but to understand. After the sentencing, Christy Mack became a key figure in raising awareness about domestic violence. She joined public campaigns, gave interviews, visited shelters for abuse survivors. She used her pain as a platform to educate. Her story helped other women speak up. She showed that even after horror, life can be rebuilt. The case also exposed how MMA and sports organizations fail to address their athletes' behavior. Many coaches, organizers, and sponsors ignored the signs because War Machine brought in views. He was entertainment. This raises an ethical debate. How far are we willing to turn pain into spectacle? And what about the prison system? War Machine is serving his sentence, but prison rarely offers rehabilitation. It's a place where violence is still the norm, where trauma deepens, where what was already dark becomes even more brutal. Does prison solve anything? Or does it just delay a problem that remains alive? The conversation also extends to pop culture. How many times have we watched shows and movies that glorify the troubled man, the aggressive anti-hero? How often do we accept violent behavior as part of a public figure's charm? The romanticization of violence doesn't begin in the ring. It begins in the script, in consumption, in silence. That's why videos like this matter, because they shine a light where there's darkness, because they break the cycle of denial, because they turn shocking stories into hard but necessary lessons. If you made it this far, ask yourself, how many men around you carry unaddressed rage? How many grew up not knowing they could ask for help? How many believe being a man means being unbreakable? Jonathan Koppenhaver was destroyed inside long before he destroyed others, and society failed him at many points. But the final responsibility is, he had choices, and he made the wrong one. May his story serve as a warning. Aggression might take someone to the top, but it's empathy that sustains humanity. War Machine forgot that, and paid the price. We live in a society that still struggles with men's emotions. From a young age, boys are taught to swallow their tears, to never show fear, to react with force. The result? Adults who don't know how to name their emotions, who confuse pain with anger, and who explode when it all builds up. The War Machine case shows, in the most extreme way, what happens when we don't offer healthy paths for dealing with frustration. He found temporary relief in MMA, a way to channel his rage. But there was never real guidance, never any support to balance strength with emotional stability. Professional sports need to re-examine their foundations. We must stop glorifying problematic athletes just because they deliver results. Education needs to start at the base, teaching that self-control is as important as physical strength, that emotional discipline is a virtue, that asking for help isn't weakness, it's maturity. The same goes for entertainment. We create idols and forget they also need boundaries. A culture that consumes scandals like episodes of a series is part of the problem. When audiences reward chaos, there will always be someone willing to play the part until real life demands a bit. War Machine was a collective creation of the family system that failed, of the school environment that ignored him, of the sports world that enabled him, of the culture that silenced him, but above all, of his own choices. We can't change the past, but we can learn from it. The story of War Machine isn't just about a man who fell. It's about everything we ignore until it's too late. If this story resonated with you, share it. Someone out there might be living the same cycle, and there's still time to break it. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and follow more real stories that need to be told. Truth, no matter how painful, is the first step toward change.